Hello, welcome to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lear Artz. I'm a professor of media studies here at Purdue Calumet. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. George Potter, who teaches English at Valparaiso University. Dr. Potter has an impressive list of publications, journal articles, book chapters, theater performance, and a recent essay in the Journal of American Drama called Alternative Transnationals, where he speaks of the opportunity for democratic resistance under globalization, which I hope we get to talk about a bit. But in general, I would say that Dr. Potter's work is an intersection of theater and politics. He has an extended study on the appearance of war on terror in plays, cinema, art, and dramas from Egypt, Jordan, Britain, and the United States, and a wide range of subject, including a book that you're currently working on, Islamophobia in Theater and the War on Terror. This surprises me.
Okay.
It was unexpected to find a theater critique or theater production that expresses contemporary political controversy. So, especially one that challenges U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
My first question, I guess, what prompted you? How did you get theater, politics, contemporary political issues all into one research agenda?
Right. I mean, I came to it from two different ways. One was working as a theater practitioner. So I have a background in playwriting and directing, and doing scholarly work on theater. And then I also came to it from the activist side, and having been involved in protests during the lead up to the Iraq War. And so my mind was on these two sets of issues. And kind of the third thing that tied it all together is I had studied literature. I'd studied literature from lots of different parts of the world, Africa, Latin America, India. No one ever taught me about theater or literature from the Middle East. And so I thought to myself, you know, I can complain about this or I can learn it. I wasn't smart enough to know that Arabic's really difficult. So I was like, I'll learn Arabic and I'll learn the literature and see what.
So you did?
So I did.
You learned to speak Arabic, okay.
I learned to speak Arabic, yeah.
10 years later.
Right. I tell my students, so Arabic's like Taoism. You measure your progress in decades, not in days.
Okay.
So I began, for my dissertation research, compiling an archive of theatric responses to the war on terror in Cairo, London, and New York. And you know, I'd begun coming across different works, particularly from the UK first, then from the US, and then I went to Egypt to do research and find out what was going on there.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Musasalat? Is that correct?
Musasalat, yeah.
Which is their soap operas?
Yeah.
And I did some short study on Egyptian soap operas and noted that they changed in their character during the Arab Spring. They became less about romance and removed from society and more about what was, or at least provided a space. Is that part of what you're talking about in transnational alternatives, that there's a space that opens up?
Yeah, I mean, that particular article was about Naomi Wallace's work,
yes.
A series of short plays about the Iraq War and Palestine. And one of the things that makes that play interesting is it draws a connection between Iraq and Palestine, which in the Middle East is really normal, and in the United States it's like there are these two separate things that have nothing to do with each other. And she's looking at the U.S. involvements in these areas, and that play was performed in different parts of the world. So Naomi Wallace, when she does her work in the U.S., she's like, you know, people critique her because she's critical of Israel as being anti-Semitic, as being too far left. When they performed it in Cairo, some of the students said it was pro-Israeli. Yeah. So, you know.
The context of meaning changes the meaning of the play.
Entirely. Yeah, so there was that kind of work. With Musasalat, my work in Jordan now is a little bit closer to that. So I'm looking at film and digital media in Jordan.
I'm not a theater person,
no, so
I'm handicapped, so I understand it was about Naomi Wallace, but one of the things that I read in passing, and it always strikes me because I get this in my own classes and my own work, is that as globalization spreads, there's an attempt to find within that spread a space for democratic resistance or opening or exchanges across borders. And it struck me that that was part of a thread that run through this. Right. And I guess I have difficulty understanding that how, you know, the spread of Disney or the spread of the World Wrestling Association or anything else provides an opening for opposition to Israeli occupation of Palestine, for instance.
Right. Well, for me, the question is, what does this resistance look like? So in the beginning of that essay, I talked about a group of theater scholars that went over to Palestine. And
Most of them weren't resistive.
No, most of them were very idiosyncratic responses, like what does going to Palestine teach me about myself?
You're right.
And I would argue this is the kind of default for American drama right now. It's heavily steeped in psychological realism and personal narratives and effective responses. What you get with someone like Naomi Wallace is the attempt to think of what is my relationship to people on the other side of the world? What do my taxes pay for? One of her essays, she talks about, the things I do so I can have money to raise a child in the U.S., what do they do to someone's child in Palestine or in Iraq? And so it's about this question of how our lives intersect on an intimate level with each other and what it takes to understand that.
How is that different than the other people that went with her that
Right.
were understanding, well, what does this tell me about? So I can see a human family in Jordan or in Palestine, and I can feel their suffering. But how does that link with what I read in some of your other work, a play about the U.S. war on terror in the United States or in Jordan, which raises the stakes from me understanding you as a Palestinian father, and I can have some simpatico, but I don't necessarily make any political conclusion from that. So.
Right, yeah, so I mean, there are a few different kind of ways to answer that. The book I'm working on, the fundamental question is a question of agency. In other words, so there's this entire body of plays, Tony Kushner's Homebody Kabul, there's work in the UK, like The Great Game about Afghanistan, Black Watch about Iraq, and the US Aftermath, which used some interviews with Iraqi refugee, that narrate the experience of being Iraqi or Afghani, to a certain extent Palestinian, from what we as Americans can do. And so no matter what, the Iraqi, the Afghani, the Palestinian is always victim, right? One of the things I like about Naomi Wallace's work is she tries to create the Palestinians and the Iraqis and the Israelis, for that matter, as fully fleshed out three-dimensional human characters that have an agency of their own, that act in the world, that are trying to find a way through these things that they're experiencing.
Once they're no longer demonized as burqa-wearing ragheads or something like American Sniper, it makes it more difficult to justify whatever the practice is.
Right. I mean, there's a scene, the scene I talk about with people in American Sniper. There's one, the first time an American is killed, they play the Islamic call to prayer in the background, like it was the theme to Jaws or something. Like we hear the call to prayer, someone has to die, right? Which was
a director's choice or a producer's choice, right? To give that meaning.
Right. You can't blame that on we're telling Chris Kyle's story.
Right.
Chris Kyle doesn't have a soundtrack.
Yes.
You made that choice, right? Yeah. So what you give Naomi Wallace is the attempt to humanize, but not just to humanize, not just to be like, oh, we have stereotypes, they're wrong, but also to give these people a voice for themselves, to give them agency. So like the theater artist that went over, one of them just used I like 20 times in his response, you know. But Naomi Wallace made reference to the Palestinian poetic tradition and the Palestinian dance tradition and talked about a girl she met in Palestine. And so it was bringing the voices of the people she found out rather than just giving her voice and her reaction to it. And I think that's
Which
important.
strikes me as a little different than, I don't know how long of a tradition it is or what slice of the tradition is in American theater, but you go to theater to escape daily life, or you go to theater to escape the war in Iraq, or you go to theater to escape Ferguson.
Right.
I mean, I have trouble imagining a theater that wouldn't be different than that, because it's so well funded and it's attracting a certain clientele that it would seem difficult to have a play that put the life of a Palestinian family center stage, so to speak.
Yeah, well, so if you look at New York, almost every play about the Iraq War bombed, and the most successful were British. So Black Watch, about one of the Scottish regiments, came over and was successful. David Hare's Stuff Happens, which was about the lead up to the Iraq War and, you know, Bush and Blair characters and so forth. It comes over and it's successful. But most of the American plays are doing terrible. No one wants to see them. Most of the films, up till The Hurt Locker, all the films were losing money, and I think The Hurt Locker made less than any film to win an Academy Award previously. So you see, like, at that kind of, on Broadway, it's really hard to do it because it costs so much to get a show on Broadway. You know, they're spending $2 million to do the Spider-Man musical or what have you. But there are other spaces in the culture that create for it. So up the road here in Chicago, there's Silk Road Rising, which is a theater that specializes on stories from
That's the name of the theater?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it specializes on stories from the Middle Eastern and Asian diaspora. And so they do work like this. They did a production of Back of the Throat, Yusuf El-Gindi, about kind of the treatment of Muslims in America after 9/11. The joke in the title is that the character's name is Khaled, and everyone keeps calling him Khaled because the FBI agents can't pronounce the on the back of the throat properly in the treatment. And so there are places that's doing. We're actually working with them at Valparaiso next fall. I'm going to direct a production of a play called Mosque Alert about a fictional attempt to build a mosque in Naperville. And so
You wrote the play? Or
I didn't write the play. No, their artistic director, Jamil Khoury, wrote it.
Okay. I think we have to take a break here.
Okay.
We'll come back, and I want to talk a little bit more about the intersection between entertainment and politics.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz, from the Communication Department here at Purdue Calumet, and I'm joined with Dr. George Potter, English professor from Valparaiso. Before we go any farther, one of the things that struck me at the close just before we went to break is we often hear that that's just entertainment. Part of what you've been writing and performing and directing has to do with plays that are essentially have a political component. What's your response to somebody who says, well, people go to the theater to avoid that. They just want to be entertained, so they want to go see Cats, or they want to see some other performance that's not political.
Right. I mean, the kind of canned answer is that all art's ideological, because all art comes from a point of perspective, meaning it's about narrating the world, it's about some perspective on the world. It conveys some ideology.
So what would a Shakespeare play be conveying for ideology today if I go see it? What's being...
I got a great answer for that. So that's when I was living in Egypt at the end of the Mubarak era, they put on a production of King Lear. So what's King Lear about? King Lear's about an old leader who's about to die and who's going to take over the kingdom after he dies, which was a really real question when you had an 80-something-year-old Mubarak, and a question of whether his sons would take over and what would happen. So people, you know, and Shakespeare's full of kinds of questions about political lineage and gender and so forth. My general sense of thing is when people say a work isn't political, what they mean is they're comfortable with the politics of it. And when they say it is political, it means they're not comfortable with the politics of it.
Politics means I don't agree with it?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's a little more, I mean, some are advertised as expressly political and so forth. But I think a lot of the ones that people say are light entertainment, it means the ideology, whether it be the representation of gender roles or sexuality or economics, are ones that the audience is assumed to already be comfortable with.
Yeah. So things, race, class, gender, state of the world are not things that you go for an easy Saturday evening.
The example I always use with my students, it's getting to be an old example, but it's a fun one, is You've Got Mail.
Okay.
You know,
the Tom Hanks.
Tom Hanks, right? Meg Ryan. Third movie they made together. We're supposed to assume they end up together and we're going to love it, right? He destroys her company, right? Like, you know, he's the corporation that comes in, destroys her company, and we're still supposed to be like fall in love with him, right? And you know, it's full of all these messages about corporatism, patriarchy, gender role. And the film it's based on is a Jimmy Stewart film, The Shop Around the Corner, where they were co-workers.
Oh, yeah.
They were equals.
Yeah.
So it was full of like a 90s era ideology of how the world should work.
How the world should work according to neoliberalism
Right.
or
I
the
tell my
economic success. Yeah.
Yeah, I tell my students the film's so evil that it makes Dave Chappelle the black sidekick. So, which is hard to do.
Well, in the same vein, I don't go to the opera much, but there was a opera, Death of Klinghoffer in New York, which I guess was a major event because it led to boycotts, counter boycotts, protests, whole series of stories. And then I know just recently, I believe his name is Ari Roth, was fired from J Theater because he had wanted to put on some plays that weren't 100% friendly to Israel. So my question is, in the light of that, and the light of the work that you've been doing, in the book you're writing about the appearance of the war on terror and on theater productions, do you think there's an increasing politicization of art, or is art just becoming more part of the political discussion, or is this just a run out of other ideas, so let's talk about this? I mean, do you see an intersection here, or am I misreading this?
I mean, I don't know if it's any more or less political. I mean, you can find political art from any period you want to look, and I think we're getting these specific debates around productions that deal with Palestine and Israel because the ability to control the narrative is fracturing. Yeah. I mean, Americans get the worst media in the world about Palestine. I mean, one of the famous examples of this is like Newsweek. There's 2 issues. I think it's from 2007. One's the international headline about Palestine. Yeah. The American one is a story about the Olympics. Like, you just take the story out, right? But with the kind of democratization of digital media, the ability of anyone to go out and shoot a documentary. The Middle East is good about pirating software, so they get the ability to edit the documentary, the ability to shoot things on cell phones, social media. The ability of Israel and Israeli supporters to control the narrative is fracturing.
It's not fracturing in the New York Times or the Tribune or the Washington Post.
No, but even the Washington Post ran a story about how in Washington, Jewish-backed cultural centers, there is a growing debate over whether you can produce something that's critical of Israel in Jewish centers. Because you have Jewish Americans who don't support the Israeli state or are critical of specific policies and so forth. The New York Theater Workshop had a huge controversy over this with the play My Name is Rachel Corrie, about the American girl that was killed by an Israeli bulldozer, I believe it was, while standing in front of a house in
For people
Gaza.
in our region, a bulldozer that was made by Caterpillar, constructed just a few miles away.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So they were originally going to do it, and then they pulled it, presumably under pressure from donors and so forth. The ability to do that's getting harder. So stories are getting out in other spaces. When you see something like 5 Broken Cameras get nominated for an Academy Award, people are finding other ways to get these stories out there. You're seeing more college-age students interested in boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And so I think some of the fighting that's going on is this debate over what work can you do in what spaces. And I think it's particularly painful for spaces that define themselves as for Jewish Americans, and does that mean a relationship with Israel?
What does it mean for artistic freedom, or what does it mean for free speech? I can understand a donor may not prevent you from doing a production in Valparaiso, but a donor may well prevent you or anybody else from doing a production at the Met. Right? I mean, there's been success in removing faculty from the University of Illinois. You just pull the funding. Alice Walker was just disinvited from the Michigan University because some errant phrase she said about Palestine in her invitation was pulled, which doesn't mean she can't speak, but the venue to speak to many remains restricted, unless I'm missing something.
But I guess my sense of these things is, well, 2 things. One, there's always censorship. I mean, so like, a donor for the Met may get upset and you can't get it produced there. Well, you'd never get it produced on Broadway because it wouldn't make enough money. I mean, so there's that level of economic censorship, and it's even worse probably with film, because you can't get it distributed to your multiplex. Now it's better with video on demand than it was 10 years ago, but still, you're not playing on the same scale as a narrative like Homeland. that's very pro-Israeli
Yeah.
can get just and produced by Israelis.
Even a bad film will get more viewing audience than a
because
good
it's
film.
safer. The politics are safer. It's back to what we were saying before. With something like the discourse for academics and so forth, it's a concern. I mean, we saw what happened at the University of Illinois this summer, but the improvement is people talk about what happened at the University of Illinois this summer. There's been an attempt to boycott that university. There have been letters criticizing it. Multiple professional associations criticized it. This has happened before without that happening. So, I mean, like someone like Norman Finkelstein was denied tenure over the fights around Palestinian discourse.
So what you're saying is there's still attempts to curb artistic expression or certain speech. The attempts remain, but the responses to those attempts
At least
have
we're talking
changed.
about it,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Yes.
and what concerns me actually aren't the one like the New York Theater Workshop that we hear about, or Stephen Salata at University of Illinois that we hear about. What concerns me are the 100 of ones that happen quietly that before there's ever in a hiring committee or in a arts council board that's never made public.
Or in a classroom.
Right.
Here's my question, because what do you say to someone that's a theater major, wants to do production, wants to do script writing, whether that's for television or for a play, and you write the script and you bring it to a producer and they say, well, I like your script, and I'll take it, I just want you to change A, B, and C, which takes a script that deals with Palestine or issues of the human condition, race and gender and class, and puts it back into a story about the individual pluck that this heroine has. I mean, what can you counsel students that want to make a career, and the career pretty much looks like you have to accept the terms of that theater, film, advertising, the rest?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are a few different things. Like if you're Naomi Wallace, who we talked about earlier, you spend half your year in the UK where it's easier to talk about these things.
Get your major at Valparaiso or Purdue Calumet and move to Britain.
I don't know. It probably depends on how well I mean, lots of young American theater writers are now getting productions done in the UK because there's a wider range of work that's being done there.
Is there more public support for that? I mean, are there more public grants and public dollars?
Yeah, I mean, so there's universities better funded, so you're not coming out with as much debt, and that helps if you want to be an artist.
Yes.
There are more.
Or if you go to Chile or Germany, it's completely paid for.
Right. That's true. The theaters that are more public funded take more risks. So a play like Stuff Happens, that was critical of Tony Blair, played at the British National.
Wow, yeah.
This wouldn't happen at the Lincoln Center in New York.
A play about the Clinton or
Center.
Obama or something.
Yeah, or the Kennedy Center. So you have these kinds of things. It's a more social-based theater. If you're going to Hollywood, you're screwed. Because they won't say, I want you to change X, Y, and Z. They'll buy the script, and then they'll change it anyway, regardless of what you think about. And this happens for non-political reasons all the time. I mean, there are all these famous arguments between like Oliver Stone and, what's his name?
But when you said non-political reasons, every reason has a political.
Well, it's economic, right?
Right. But that's I would argue that's a political position as well. If you're going to say, we're going to make this because we want to make money, you're essentially making a political statement that making money is more important than presenting an artistic or creative endeavor. Yeah.
Generally, I would agree. There are some that would argue are non-political, like your climax needs to be introduced 1 minute earlier because that's where we hit our beats in a Hollywood film. There are these kinds of things that go on. In the theater world, they're less likely to change your script, but they don't have much money to give you anyway. This is the balance. Hollywood will change your story, but they'll give you money. Theater scripts are more protected in most contracts, but you're going to have to find the kind of theater that does the kind of work you want to do. And that's the challenge. And then you're going to have to make the choice for yourself. And this is a choice artists have made for centuries. It's anything new. How commercial do I want to be? I mean, 500 years ago, it's do I want to write poetry praising the king to get a nice salary? I mean,
today it's different. Although I noticed when I was looking at your vita and the things that you've done, I've noticed you've been successful in getting some things produced or directed. There was a play on Eugene V. Debs, who's a Hoosier. Most Hoosiers don't know that he was a working class hero, and you directed that. And then
I didn't direct. I was in the cast.
You were in the cast.
A friend of mine wrote it.
I didn't even know there was such a thing, but it was at Terre Haute at Indiana State. That's right.
I mean, a friend of mine that was from Terre Haute, where Eugene V. Debs is from, wanted to write this play about Debs and labor politics.
And people came and watched it.
people came and watched it.
Excellent. And the other one I wanted to mention was Emmett Till. Again,
Co-wrote.
You co-wrote that. So, but that somehow got funding, and this is like 50 years after the case of the young man. I think he was from Chicago, and was beaten and killed in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And you did a play about that. Again, people attended. It was successful.
Yeah, and you know the challenge for that play, co-wrote it. Monique Mosley, a friend of mine, also in Terre Haute. We were commissioned to co-write this together. And then
By
oh man, it was a Human Rights Day celebration in Terre Haute, and then it got produced recently in Indianapolis.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
The challenge with a work like that, so like they'll give you the Emmett Till play because Emmett Till happened 50 years ago, right? How do you make that story about today? So what we did is throughout the play there are slides that talk about things like Ferguson, or at the time we were writing originally James Byrd that got dragged behind the truck in Texas. Because these stories still exist today. The story of Emmett Till is the story of Trayvon Martin. And we need to connect those dots.
Well, I'm impressed. I'm happy to meet you and talk to you today.
Thanks.
I've been impressed with your work. I'd like to see the idea that creative energies and artistic perspectives can raise questions about our actual condition as humans in the 21st century, race, class, and gender. So I really look forward to more of your work, and I'd like to invite you back here to Purdue Calumet for some of the other things. So
thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in today to Calumet Roundtable. My name is Lear Artz. My guest today was Dr. George Potter. Thank you for joining us, and tune in again for our next Calumet Roundtable special, which will be next week. Thank you.